Just over a year ago, I built this desk from scratch for my home office. I built these drawer cabinets out of plywood and added a solid ash wood top. I've been meaning to build a set of matching floating shelves for over a year now, but seem to keep putting it off. Partly because I wasn't sure how to install floating shelves, partly because I'm afraid of these plaster walls, but mostly because I've been busy and always have a good reason to put it off to another day. If you follow me on Instagram, you'll know that I've partnered with Moosehead to help give you the know-how to tackle one thing that's on your to-do list that you've also been putting off. And that's probably for some of the same reasons that have prevented me from getting started. And so, on behalf of Moosehead's mission to inspire Canadians to get things done, I'm going to show you my step-by-step process for how to build and install these floating shelves, and earn a beer with your name on it in the process. Alright, let's get started. To build these shelves, I'm going to use this rough sawn ash wood. Now, if you're interested in learning about the milling process, I'll jump right in. If you'd rather skip this and just buy shelves, feel free to jump ahead to the installation portion of the video using the chapters. The hardware I'm using says to make your shelves no thicker than 1 1/4 inch. So normally I'd start with 6/4 rough lumber, but I couldn't find any. All they had were these beefy 8/4 boards, which means I'm going to be wasting a lot more material than I'd like. But that's the only option I have. It also means that the wood may be more prone to warping and cupping after milling because I'm going to be removing so much material. So with that in mind, I'm going to space out the milling process over a few days to let the lumber acclimate at each step, and also be mindful to remove the same amount of material from each end of the board and each face of the board. Some of these boards are too wide for my joiner, so I'm going to use a planer sled instead. Gaps or high spots like this one will get a shim with a bit of hot glue to hold it in place. I'll also apply a few dabs of hot glue along the edges to secure it to the sled. Once dry, I can run the sled through my planer. I'll lower the cutter head and keep running the board through until the top face is nice and flat. At this point, the board can then be removed from the sled. I'll then run it through the planer with the flattened side facing down, and repeat until the second face is flat and parallel to the first one. My goal for this first planing session is to get the thickness down to roughly 1 3/4 inch. So I'll run it through a few more times, making sure to flip it over on each pass to remove even amounts from each face. Okay, that's it for day 1. I'll just sticker them and let them sit for a few days until the next milling session. A few days later, the boards look like they've stayed flat, but the planer sled reveals some slight warping. So just as before, I'll glue down some shims and run the board through the planer until the top face is flat. I can then remove the sled and run the other face through until flat. Today my goal is to bring the thickness down to 1 1/2 inches. Next, I'll use my joiner to square up one edge. If you don't have a joiner, you can build a homemade joiner sled for the table saw. Just Google it. I ran this board through maybe 4 times until the edge was square to the faces. I can now run that square fence against the table saw's fence and cut the boards to 4 inches wide. This will also square up the final edge. I'll be using 2 pieces to make each of the shelves that'll be 8 inches deep, which is the maximum allowable depth according to the instructions. I like to come back 45 minutes after the glue up and use a plastic scraper to remove all the glue before it dries. At this point, it's time for the final trip through the planer, bringing the shelves down to their final thickness, which will be 1 3/8. If you're paying attention, you might have caught me earlier saying that the max thickness is 1 1/4 inch, but you'll see in a bit that I'm going to beef up the shelf support, so I'm pretty sure that an extra 1/8 won't cause any massive failures. I need to square up the ends and cut them to their final length. I'll cut both shelves together using my track saw, but you could also cut each of them one at a time using a miter saw or a circular saw with a guide. Now I can just measure the final length and repeat on the opposite side. Before applying a finish, I sanded with 80 grit, then 120 grit, and finally with 220 grit. I'm using the same finish that I use on my desk so they'll match, and that's Osmo Pollux oil. I'll leave a link to this product and all the other products I use in the description below. I just love how easy it is to apply. I use a plastic spreader to flood the surface, then simply wipe it off and buff it with a clean cloth. 2 coats is all that's needed. Back in my office now, I started to plan the install. I used some tape to mock up the height and spacing of the shelves to get a feeling for it. This worked out to about 26 inches above the desktop for the bottom shelf, with the second one roughly 16 inches above that one. Now I need to draw a 7-foot long straight line on that piece of tape so I can install the shelf hardware. I found a way to prop up a laser level to the exact height so I could then mark the line using a straight edge. You could just use the 4-foot level without the laser level, but the laser definitely makes it easier. Next it's time to find all the studs along this line. I have 3 different stud finder options here. Now I don't want to bore you with too many details, but if you have plaster walls like I do, a basic stud finder like this one probably won't work. It can't read deep enough to get an accurate reading, so it just goes berserk. The instructions recommend using a rare earth magnet, which actually does work. As you slide it along the wall, you can feel it pull when you pass over a screw or a nail head in my case. This method will give you a pretty good idea, but still won't be super precise. After some research, I decided to purchase this stud finder, and boy were the reviews right. This is a deep scan stud finder which can look deep into the wall beyond the plaster and lath and clearly shows the full width of each stud. I found the location of each stud and marked the edges on my line. And by the way, don't assume your studs are spaced at 16 inches on center, especially if you have an old house. Mine are actually spaced every 12 inches, more or less. This is the shelf hardware I'm going to use. The instructions, which are really well done by the way, #not-sponsored, say that the supports offer a capacity of 100 pounds for a 4-inch deep shelf or 50 pounds for an 8-inch deep shelf, like the one I'm going to install. Now that's if you have a short shelf that only spans over 2 studs. For every additional bracket that you use, you add another 25 pounds of support capacity for an 8-inch shelf. Now my shelf spans over 7 studs, so that works out to a capacity of 175 pounds per shelf. Not bad. I'll center the hardware on each stud location and mark the screw holes on the line. Using a 1/8 drill bit, I'll drill some pilot holes roughly 1.5 inches deep into each stud. I got a little carried away and forgot to remove the tape before installing the brackets into the pilot holes. If you did your prep work right, this is the easy part and really satisfying to see it all come together. Especially when the laser level confirms you installed them perfectly level. I repeated the same process for the top shelf. I can now drop one of the shelves onto the supports to mark the locations I'll need to drill out. Using a small square, I'll mark the width of each bracket onto the bottom of the shelf. With that done, I'll head back to the garage and transfer all those lines onto the back side of the shelf. I didn't want to mess up the visible faces of the shelf, so I used tape, but I don't care about the back, cause no one will ever see it. To find the center point, I'll simply draw an X between the lines. To stabilize the shelf on end while I drill into it, I built these basic supports out of some scraps. They'll also provide support for this drill guide I'm going to use. It's important that the holes be perfectly perpendicular. I could use my drill press, but the size of this shelf and its weight makes it pretty awkward. This portable drill guide, on the other hand, is a great alternative for drilling straight holes. I'm using a 7/16 brad point drill bit, and I'm going to go as deep as I can using the guide as a first step. A word of advice, if you have a corded drill, use it. Drilling these holes with a cordless drill is hard work. Before I even reached the end, my drill overheated and started making some beeping noises at me. After that's done, you'll also need a longer bit to drill down to 5¼ inches deep. I attempted this with my cordless drill, but I was getting nowhere. Only then did I remember I actually have a hammer drill, so I turned the hammer setting off so it could be used as a regular drill, and this made finishing the holes so much easier. Okay, the last step before installation is to chisel out the back of the shelf to countersink the mounting plates. But instead of chiseling out 14 mortises, I decided to take a shortcut and use my router table to cut a stop dado along the back. Here I'm drilling relief holes at each end that I can use as a starting stopping point for the router bit. After firing up the router table, I'll gently lower the shelf into the first relief hole, then push the board all the way through until I reach the hole on the opposite end. I can then flip the board around and repeat. I'll end up with a centered groove that should fit the hardware perfectly. This was way easier than chiseling by hand. Okay, moment of truth. Let's see if this shelf will fit onto the supports. You probably don't know this about me, but I hate mounting things on the wall. I always get nervous and feel like the thing, whatever it is, will ultimately fail and crash down to the floor. But when all the pins slipped into place, I began to feel optimistic. And as I hammered it in, I started feeling pretty good about this install. I felt especially good when the bubble in the spirit level confirmed it was perfectly level. How satisfying is that? I used the laser level to align the top shelf with the bottom one, and repeated the same process of marking and drilling the holes. I finally got to use this support rod I got at Princess Auto that I've been looking for an excuse to use. You can adjust it to the exact height that you need, and it really acts like a second pair of hands. The top shelf took a bit more convincing, but eventually conceded. Ultimately, this install definitely feels like a success. After this accomplishment, I most definitely deserve a beer with my name on it. By the way, once you've completed a task you're proud of, post it on Instagram and tag @Moosehead before the end of July for your chance to score an actual beer with your name on it. What projects will you tackle? Let me know in the comments down below. Hey, I hope you liked this video, and if you're interested in the desk build or the cabinet builds, I have those videos lined up for you here. Until next time, thanks for watching, see you soon.